Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time center of pestilence, and welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss magic, mysticism, religion, the occult, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. And in this video, I want to discuss an important topic and one that I've seen being discussed increasingly less, and that would be the divine feminine. After this video comes out in about 2 weeks, or maybe it'll be a month, I don't always shoot in order. I will be releasing a divine masculine video to complement this video and show the other side, the other end of the polarity as well. But in this video, I will be focusing on the divine feminine, and I want to talk about what that is, what that means, how to embody it, the history of sort of working with the divine feminine, various archetypes, and why we shouldn't throw the concept away. So let's break into it. First of all, I think we need to discuss a little bit about where the idea of gender in metaphysics come from. I think a lot of people assume that when we discuss gender in metaphysics, we're sort of just assigning human concepts onto divine things arbitrarily. And to an extent, there is a little bit of sense to this take. After all, a lot of metaphysical concepts we explain through metaphor. Most of these things are really abstract and vague and beyond human comprehension. In many traditions, it's even understood that the mind of a human could never fully understand the mind of the divine. And this is where a lot of that trope of a mystic completely losing their mind when they have too much knowledge comes from. The idea that too much knowledge just kind of shatters the brain. So to avoid our brains being shattered, we have to put things through our own lens and filter them through our own biases and cultural understandings. This is also a pretty good argument for why you see different practices and in different cultures that have overlapping themes and concepts, like how things like meditations and mantras have emerged in cultures that never actually interacted with each other historically. So there's some truth to that, but the gender idea is a little bit more complicated than we saw a goddess that is nice and we said they're feminine. If anything, I hope one of the lessons you take away from this video is that femininity is not just the stereotypical woman holding a baking bowl and being pregnant in the kitchen, right? That is not what femininity is. Femininity is a lot more complex and is a lot more abstract than that and can mean a lot more things. First of all, we're talking about divine principles, not physical bodies. A lot of people will take the divine feminine thing and apply it very physically to the womb, to the period, to all of that. And there is some value in that. After all, that does sort of relate to these ideas. But in a metaphysical sense, we're not talking just about the body. If that is something that personally calls to you, empowers you, awesome, go with it. But the divine feminine can be a lot more than that. In fact, in Thelema, which is the tradition that I follow, our idea of gender comes mostly from this idea of the active and the restrictive principle. So let's go back to Qabalah a little bit. I promise this makes sense. When we look at the tree of life, we see that things come from the source, the one point in the circle, right? The beginning of everything, and then it has to expand. It has to grow. It has to move forward. It has to create. It has to generate. If you're someone who's really into astrology, think Jupiter, the greater benefic, right? When you have a Jupiterian moment in your life, a bunch of stuff comes in, a bunch of new beginnings start, a bunch of growth happens. But endless expansive growth causes problems. If there's too much growth, things lose control. You become unbalanced. You never have any form, and you never actually complete the thing to begin with. And so because of that, you need the receptive, the thing that catches, that gives form, that gives shape, that brings the things to life. And that is the feminine, the severity. In astrology, think something like Saturn, right? It's that restrictive thing that gives us boundaries, right? We need a bit of contraction to stop the endless growth that we're balanced, right? If you had all these new things coming in, but never had the discipline to reject things that may distract you from the other things you're part of, or to set boundaries in relationships that are overstepping, you become deeply unbalanced and unhappy. That it is the active and receptive principle. And those are often applied to masculine being the active and feminine being the receptive. That means that there is both masculinity and femininity inside every single person. As you can see on the tree of life, you have masculine, feminine. My camera mirrors, so I'm hoping I pointed right. I'm gonna pop a tree of life up here to make sure that I'm pointing correctly. If I'm not, I'm so sorry, guys. My camera makes everything weird. I never know whether it's mirrored or not. Anyways, I don't think you guys care about my technical notes. Let's get back into talking about gender. And in the center, there's that equilibrium, and that's where the material plane is. That means within us, there's both masculine and feminine. That's why if you look at traditions like Wicca, it's always recommended to work with both a god and a goddess to balance yourself out. In many ways, this merged form, whether you want to call it androgyny, the magical child, equilibrium, is recognized as well. So it's a lot more complicated than this idea of like carrying a mixing bowl, though there are goddesses that definitely relate to that archetype, and that's completely legitimate if that is something you want to tap into. But I just want to get that out of the way first. We're talking about metaphysics, not bodies. We're talking about something much more abstract, not so literal. So now that we understand what exactly the feminine means and that the feminine is something more abstract, metaphysical, we talk about metaphysics on this channel. This is a metaphysical channel. Let's talk about what it can do. What can it look like? How can you tap into this? So the first way that I like to explore the divine feminine, and I can already see some people watching this rolling their eyes at me because they don't like it, they think it is outdated, they think that it's cliche, is the mother, maiden, crone. In many, many cultures, there's this idea of triple-faced deities, triple-faced goddesses, gods, etc. And one way this is explored, specifically in modern Wiccan practices, is through the mother, maiden, and the crone. So this basically breaks a woman's life into 3 phases. The maiden is when you are young, when you are small, when you are growing up, you are developing, you're becoming a maiden, you're exploring your youth. Then there is the mother, which is where you enter your sort of maturity. You bring new life forth into the world. You take on that maternal role. And then there is the crone, the wise woman living out in the woods in her hut, etc. And these archetypes, I think, have a lot of value to them because culturally, we are socialized into this idea that aging is bad. We are sold expensive aging cream. We are told that we need to wear 10 pounds of makeup and cover up any sign of aging. But that is actually part of our life cycle. Life exists in a cycle, and I like to get a little inspired by one writer on the divine feminine who wrote a famous book called Woman Running with the Wolves to divide life into something that's more like a circle rather than like a constant decrease of value. And that would be as life, death, and rebirth. And this cycle is how life is designed to go. And the mother, maiden, crone emphasizes that life is a cycle. During this archetype, the woman and the feminine does not lose value. It does not, and we are often told that the feminine loses value once you've given birth. You're valuable until you're about like 25 to 30, and then you have to start getting Botox and plastic surgery and putting on aging cream to not become less valuable. But this visualizes the feminine as a cycle. You go and you are a maiden and you are living your life. You're frolicking through the fields. You're finding love. You're deciding who you ought to be. Then you are the mother. The mother and the maternal archetype is another thing that gets boiled down a lot. We picture the mother as this like mommy loving thing. And a lot of goddesses that are considered mother goddesses are kind of in this category. But there are also mothers within mythology and religious text that are not this way. Let's actually turn to nature, okay? When you are walking down a hiking trail and you see a baby cub, you always walk away because you know the mama bear is gonna emerge from the woods to rip your face off. That is another part of the mother. In a great book called Untie the Strong Woman, it explores the idea of Mother Mary. I highly suggest reading this book. And how the mother is not just softness, the mother is strength. Even the concept of bringing life into the world. And there are many rituals that sort of go off this theme of giving life into the world, even if it's not literal childbirth. There's a lot of pain from that. It begins with darkness, and then through pain becomes life. And that strength is essential to the idea of motherhood and the matron archetype. I think we need to disconnect the idea of a feminine mother from necessarily being softness. That's definitely there, and there is strength in softness. To be kind, to be giving, to serve your community, that's a beautiful thing, and that should not be underestimated, but that is not solely what a mother archetype is. And then, of course, there is the crone. The crone is the wise woman, the woman who has wrinkles, yet is able to save her village through herbal remedies and recipes, things like that. That is wise, that is powerful. Too often, I think the idea of a wise archetype is thrown onto the divine masculine as like the hermit in the woods, but there has always been a feminine version of this, a version of this that is the divine feminine. And so in a way, I think the mother, maiden, crone cycle is an antidote to the modern idea that women lose value as they age, or that beauty is all that femininity is. Beauty is certainly a layer of femininity, though you do see in masculine entities in mythology beauty being applied to them too. But there's more to the divine feminine than beauty. And another part of the divine feminine that's been getting a little bit more traction lately that is always fun to explore is the dark feminine. There has always been a darker side to femininity, whether this is Lilith or Circe or some entity like that. There's always been this darker, shadowier part of the feminine. This could be the sexy siren, or the lady of the night, or the one who rejects what Adam's advances were in favor of her own will and determination. That is also the divine feminine. The divine feminine can be a million different things. It has so much complexity and layers. Kali is just as much the divine feminine as Demeter is. Both are aspects of this thing. Common ways the divine feminine can be explored is through the mother, the maiden, the crone, of course, the wild woman, the woman who runs with the wolves through the wilderness and is not afraid to be herself no matter what, the dark feminine, the Liliths of the world. It can also be the priestess, the wise woman who serves her community, because in the ancient pagan days, when paganism was, the mainstream faith prior to the European conversion, there were full temples devoted just to women. Specifically, Bonadia, a Roman goddess, had a temple where men were not even allowed to enter, and everyone in the temple was a woman. She was a fertility goddess, by the way. I'll link some resources on her down below because she's one that doesn't really get much coverage, very, very sadly. And as well, there were the cults of Diana and Artemis, who is the huntress and is typically embodied by people who, when they're exploring the feminine, don't want to do it in a complementary way to the divine masculine, because that celibate being with just women, embodying your huntress spirit is just as feminine and just as part of the divine feminine and always have been. Even in the Bible, which biblical womanhood is often boiled down to like this 50s housewife thing, which is not what the Bible really argues for. The Bible argues for a virtuous woman, which that can look very different ways. There's actually multiple types of divine femininity referenced. There's the Mother Mary, but there's also Mary Magdalene. There's a lot that goes into the divine feminine beyond this stereotypical impression. But even if a woman wants to embody that traditional femininity, that Demeter type woman, that is legitimate too. If you're a feminine person and that's what you're drawn to, that's totally fine. There are tons of goddesses like that, but the divine feminine is so many things. After all, the divine feminine is what gives shape and form to the universe, allowing us to live inside of it and forge our paths forward. Without the divine feminine, the universe would be completely out of whack. Things would be impossible to be what they are. It's a critical part, and it's an entire pillar on the tree of life, which is how divinity enters and flows through the world through emanations. Divine feminine is essential. And even on the tree of life, the divine feminine is portrayed in multiple ways. You see it in Binah, you see it in Gevurah, and those are very, very different things. Like, the way that those interact are radically different, yet they are still on the same pillar. The divine feminine is something that can be accessible to everyone. You do not need to push yourself into the box of what femininity should be or what culture tells you femininity shouldn't be, because culture definitely is opposed to certain forms of femininity in many ways, especially depending on where you are. Your femininity should be in line with your true will, and you should look into mythology and look into religious texts to see what style of femininity calls to you, what deities work with you. And even if you are a man or a masculine person watching this, Aleister Crowley, the founder of Thelemite, had a really interesting take that you should work with gods and goddesses that are counter to your own personal energy and self. So if you're a very masculine person, there's a lot of strength in working with a feminine spirit to balance yourself out and discover that these two can work together in a beautiful and harmonious way. The masculine and the feminine complement each other. They are not opposed. You do not need to choose one. They work and they flow flow together, because without both of them, we would not be in the plane that we are in. They work together. They're not opposites. They're a polarity. Polarity means that they are on a spectrum. They are not like completely separate things. Manon Hendenborg White, a woman who writes about Thelema, actually described femininity in really interesting ways in her book, The Eloquent Blood. When she talked about Babylon, which is a goddess associated with Thelema, Babylon is a very fiery, sexy, she rides the beast, brings in the horns of revelations, all this stuff. She is described as what Manon Hindenburg calls like an active femininity, a sort of masculinized femininity. She's still feminine. She's still part of the divine feminine, but she acts in a very aggressive, forward way. She's the woman girt with a sword, but she's still the woman. She is still femininity, even if she is expressing it in a way that is not the typical expression of femininity. All of these archetypes are powerful and valuable and have layers of complexity to them. Whether it is the mother, the maiden, the crone, the dark feminine, Babylon, they're all rich with layers to them. And to actually work with these, there are multiple ways you can do that. When we look into how the divine feminine has been explored historically, it can be in the sort of Abrahamic way where you kind of embody the divine feminine. Like if you're a Christian woman, you're probably going to look at the stories around Mary and sort of embody her virtue and walk through your life with that in mind and with that guiding your actions. You're going to be like, how can I learn from the lessons of Mary? How can I be a virtuous woman? How can I do these things and apply that to my life? How can I use her strength to stand by my principles? How can I use her maternal wisdom to raise my own family in the future? Or you can work with them as archetypes by like literally working with them. You can set up like altars to them. Like maybe if you want to have a kind of nuanced and balanced perspective of femininity, you could say set up an altar to someone like Artemis and also set up an altar to someone like Aphrodite, allowing you to explore two very different femininities to get a grasp of what femininity could be. As well, you can do invocation, which is literally like calling in. Invocation, which I can make a whole video on this. I've talked about this numerous times. It's basically where you use a call, whether it's a hymn, a call, or just an invocation, and you embody the goddess or spirit by calling them into your body and letting them sort of ride your body a little bit and communing with them in that way. You can do veneration. You set up an altar, you leave offerings, you pray, stuff like that, just in a very devotional way. A lot of people who would call themselves devotional polytheists do this. Like, you can work with gods and goddesses without actually being an occultist who does things like magic or rituals. You can just be a devotional person. That's completely legitimate and a valid path forward. You can look to historic discussions of the divine feminine. In the 1970s, there was this thing called the goddess movement, mostly out of a writer called Starhawk, which really sort of reclaimed the divine feminine. A lot of women were very, very empowered by it. And so there's a bunch of rituals and rites, like say the circle dance, which is where you like dance in a circle. It's pretty self-explanatory. There's a book on it. It's good. That explore the divine feminine. You can take influence from those movements. There are whole sects devoted to it, like Dianic Wicca, though I caution a little bit with the Dianic Wicca because there are some kind of questionable things associated with it. I assume if you're watching this video, you're capable of doing your own research. If I ever mention a group or a movement, do your own research before you like join them. I'm a girl on YouTube, okay? I'm not like an all-seeing, omnipresent eye, okay? Do your own research. But there are things like that. In Thelema in particular, there's been like an entire organization set up devoted to venerating Babylon, and they've made like full Babylon masses, which is really cool because a lot of Thelemic rituals are so divine masculine heavy that it's really cool to see the other side getting some representation. And really anything between that. You don't even need to be really necessarily spiritual to be inspired by the divine feminine. You can simply like learn lessons from them. The book Women Who Run with the Wolves, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is written by a Jungian psychoanalyst who also studied myth. And so it takes all these myths and it applies them to how you can learn the lessons through your life. I found the book really healing and beautiful. And so you can just like take these stories to inspire you and help you explore what femininity means to you. If you're someone who feels really detached from femininity, say you're a very masculine person, you're a manly man, you can still discover that there is some strength in femininity and read these stories and still take some lessons from them. There's no need to completely like separate the two. So that's kind of the gist of what I wanted to discuss. My whole lesson from this video that I hope you guys take away from it is that femininity is for everyone. Femininity is something that is beautiful. It is part of what makes our world unique and valuable. And it's not exactly just cooking up in the kitchen. Though if you want to do that, power to you. I personally like the cooking in the kitchen thing. It's fun, but there is more complexity to it. And if you look even into different cultures, which I only really know the Western tradition as well, to the point where I feel like I can speak on it. I don't know the Eastern stuff to the extent that I would say I could like teach on it. I think the Eastern tradition is equally as beautiful. I love the Eastern stuff, even if I'm not as versed on it. Archetypes over there can teach a very different femininity as well and help you explore all these archetypes. But fundamentally, femininity is complex. It's multifaceted. There's not one single way to be feminine. And I wish you all luck on your femininity journey. If you want to support me, I'm Georgina Rose or Dot Darling. I'm on pretty much every platform. I'm on YouTube. I host the podcast Magnolias and Magic, everywhere podcast can be found, mostly. Most platforms? It's not everywhere, but it's a lot of places. It's linked below. I'm also on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Vero, Telegram, and you can also watch these videos on Odyssey. I also have a Patreon where you get all these videos early. You get an extra video every month, and all my extra videos are like more advanced or more niche topics that I don't really feel are fit for the main channel. So if you want to go a little bit deeper, those are the videos to watch. You get access to my Discord, and if you're a high enough tier, you can poke my brain, and I also give ritual guides every single month. But if you don't want to join my Patreon, you can donate directly through Ko-Fi. It doesn't even take a fee. So it's basically like donating on PayPal, but with a bit more anonymity. Okay, guys, I have the reader's accent. Pronouncing words is hard, okay? I'm too ascended for pronunciation. And like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you're subscribed for 93 days, you will meet your holy guardian angel, and you'll never have to hear the word feminine again.